Well, Steve, I have to say what an honor it is to have this opportunity to talk with you about the impressive collection of the work that you have done over the years to tell so many important stories. I think the best starting place is what drew you into this field of journalism because I know that as you grew up, you didn't see a lot of people who looked like you on TV.
Judy, for one thing, it's an honor to be with you and knowing what you mean to people in South Carolina and the Midlands. It's just a wonderful moment that we're sharing together. And to answer your question, you're absolutely right. The first time I ever saw an African American on television was in my hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, back in 1968, and the individual's name was Phil Buckman, who went on to become a very successful producer at NBC News. The reality was, Buckman was thrown into a situation where he's covering racial disturbances and the riots. And based on his reporting, it was an inspiration to an entire community of people that perhaps have been disenfranchised. But in many respects, he did give that voice to the voiceless, and that served as a platform, at least as far as getting people's viewpoints out that necessarily had been silenced for many, many years.
And Steve, the thing about it is, I always tell people when I talk about your work that you're a storyteller of all storytellers, really, because so much of your work has focused on the untold stories that lend so much insight to all of us about the landscape of our history and what has brought us to where we are today. Many of the documentaries that you have produced are often, like I said, stories that just are not well known in our community. One in particular, the story of Sarah Mae Flemming, or the Friendship Nine, that you and I have talked about often. Can you tell us, Steve, just give us some insight about what has drawn you to historical works like that?
I think when you're able to meet these individuals, to reach out and touch, to hear their side of it, I mean, in many respects, I'm just still a basic news guy, that goes to the newsroom every day and does the minute 30 and, calls it a day at the end of the day. But in many respects, having the opportunity to do longer form kinds of pieces where, for me, I think news writing or storytelling comes down to two basic fronts. It's either give me Run Spot Run or give me Tolstoy's War and Peace. And I think that the documentaries have kind of borderlined on Tolstoy's War and Peace because you're able to get into a person's life, their emotions, and a lot of the things that help define their greatness and the impact in an area where they live. And you're able to do it where you don't have as many time constraints. So in that regard, understanding the gravity of what it is they particularly bring and the fact that those kinds of stories and tales and moments in history perhaps give voice and validation is very, very meaningful.
Steve, one of the other aspects that make you such an incredible storyteller is that you do the research. You really dive in to understand the context and all of the subtleties that kind of play into whatever that pivotal moment may have been in civil rights history or into a particular person's character that allowed them to meet the moment. Talk a little bit about your research process that you invest so much time in as you produce these stories.
It's insane. I think that's one way of putting it. And the research process is never the same. I think that the best analogy that I can use is perhaps it's like finding needles in haystacks. How many needles can I particularly find in a haystack? It might mean being at the library at the campus of the University of South Carolina, or spending time at the National Archives, the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., or being at the library at the College of Charleston, or even, at South Carolina State in Orangeburg. So it's not so much the adage of being a bookworm per se, but knowing the nuggets that you're going to find and perhaps stringing those nuggets together in pearls, which can make a very fabulous necklace.
Steve, talk a little bit about the platform for the important work that you've done because in this business of journalism, these stories aren't always so easily or well received. Like you said, it doesn't fit the typical template for TV news, but you have found a way to make sure that these stories resonate not just for the African American community, but for our communities at large. What were the biggest obstacles you had to overcome to really get your work seen on those kind of important platforms?
I think developing a reputation. I am very grateful for the platform that you guys have given me in South Carolina at WIS. I'm also very grateful for the platform, considering the fact that a good bit of my work has been shown on South Carolina educational TV, ETV. I think the more that you do, the more bona fide, the more legitimate your reputation, becomes as a storyteller. Where if you contact somebody and say, "Hey, I have a program that you might be interested in," there's a greater chance now, having a track record or a library of sorts, that people will bite and people will give you the opportunity. Whereas, you go back 20 years ago and it's like, well, there he goes again. He's knocking on our door again. Maybe we'll give him a shot. Maybe we'll play this piece. And the fact of the matter is that there have been people along the way that have taken chances that have worked out. So I think a lot of it is having a track record, having the opportunity to showcase your work in a number of different platforms. And even today, Judy, compared to when you and I first got in this business, there are so many different venues and platforms. I mean, there's now YouTube, there are people doing Facebook Live every day. There are Zoom calls. I mean, so finding a vehicle isn't as hard as it was, say, 20 years ago.
That's so true, Steve, that there's so many other avenues now, but to see your work showcased in so many platforms, to really shine a spotlight on your work, is so gratifying for me, because I know the investment that you make personally in sharing these stories. Another aspect that I admire so much about your work is that you are unafraid of tackling these subjects that are still, quite frankly, very painful to talk about. They are painful to relive. We saw that in your work, Orangeburg, 50 years later.
Sadness, years later, from a deadly police shooting at this historically black college.
It was so scary that night.
All the phone lines were cut. There was no outside communication.
The violence that started at this bowling alley blocks away later landed at a state university.
We didn't have anything to make them fear for their lives back then.
South Carolina State College remains closed today following last Thursday night's bloody battle in which 3 Negroes were killed and 36 others injured in a fight with police.
Well, I found double-aught buckshot across the street here the next morning.
Ultimately, the cops were charged.
They came out there with the weapons for killing.
The verdict didn't rest well with families feeling a sense of loss.
I experienced confusion. I experienced, being upset.
One former governor still isn't satisfied with the outcome.
I don't think we ever had a complete accounting for what happened.
A half-century later, this fight for civil rights has pages and years of unfinished business.
Nothing has been done to change what had happened on that day.
The names of the dead and injured are firmly etched into the landscape of this college.
Talk a little bit about, Steve, about how you approach those subjects, because when those kinds of stories air, it is inevitable that we hear someone say, "Oh, we don't want to look back at that painful chapter. Why can't we just move forward?" How do you approach those topics, those subjects, those events that are still painful to talk about today?
Well, I think telling the story does, in fact, move it forward. You look at a situation such as in Orangeburg, and we had that 50th anniversary back in 2018. There was some national attention, but in many respects, when people get that information, and especially so many transplants to the Carolinas, which is, gee, I didn't know that. Everybody hears about Kent State, but everybody doesn't necessarily hear about Orangeburg. And when you're able to sit face to face with some of the people that endured the hardship, not necessarily the racial aspect of it, of being denied admittance to, the bowling alley. It was bigger than the bowling alley, to be quite honest. But when you're talking to some of the graduates of that institution that were shot by members of the Highway Patrol that night and went to court and testified and had to deal with the hardship of seeing no one go to jail for the crimes that were committed that night on the part of law enforcement. Those are the people who need to be heard. And the fact of the matter is that you try to, at least where we've been lucky, and even in the case of so many of the folks that we've interviewed over the years, to catch them before they pass away. And the fact that there is a recorded record somewhere of the hardships that they endured and what it is they went through, that perhaps brings us a better sense of understanding.
And Steve, how do you respond to those who say, they look at your work and they look at these complex issues of race. They look at the civil rights movement and they say, you know what? We know about all of that. We've experienced all of that. We just need to look forward. I've heard it 1,000 times. If racism was such a big problem in this country, why did we elect our first African American president? How do you respond to those who just are not open to revisiting these stories to learn the important lessons that are still so relevant today?
Well, what I found amazing, people say, hey, we're in a post-racial society, but when you look at what happened in the last presidential administration, the fact that you had a surge in hate crimes, I think that shows that we're not in a post-racial society and that some of the old wounds have in fact been reopened. Judi, I remember when you and I were in Columbia together when the Confederate flag was removed from the state grounds of the Capitol, which was a very tumultuous summer because you had the whole situation with Mother Emanuel, which I had done a documentary on, along with the Charleston police shooting that happened several months before. So, I think that in order to move a society forward, to use a line from somebody that talked about South Africa and its Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the fact that they made some strides and some progress, before you have reconciliation, you got to have truth. And truth comes in the storytelling.
It really does, Steve. A lot of your work as a journalist has focused on issues of race, and that's particularly important to you as a Black journalist, and no surprise that you have had to confront racism in a lot of ways. One of the most compelling confrontations that I remember over the course of your career, and we've talked about a lot of different things when we've been together, but it occurred when you were filming Standing in the Face of Hate.
The ideals expressed by this man, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., helped move our nation forward. But in 2016, the racism he endured remains very real. I experienced it recently firsthand while on assignment in Charleston, South Carolina, covering Hurricane Matthew.
N as in Nancy, I as in Indigo, G as in Grant.
Brian Ivers' portrait of the offensive N-word went local, national, global, and viral. And what gives you the right to call me that?
The Constitution of the United States.
And Steve, it was just remarkable to see the exchange and also to witness how you responded to it. Talk to me, take me back to that moment, and also take me through your thought process of how you wanted to share that, because there were a lot of different ways you could have responded.
Well, we were in Charleston covering Hurricane Matthew. I've done a lot of hurricanes, especially being down on the Battery in Charleston. Floyd, Hugo, I mean, the list goes on, going back some 30 plus years. And it was a Saturday afternoon, and it was a typical cleanup story. The storm has come, the people are taking the plywood off their windows, they're picking up limbs and, the whole bit. So we're in downtown Charleston, and, we're just getting, the quote, the B-roll shots of people cleaning up their yards and, that sort of a thing. And there's a guy that comes by with his iPad, and he's doing what people do with their cell phones typically, and their iPads, where they're taking pictures. And he just started just saying some disparaging things. He's like, there's a black guy here, and he turns the iPad towards me, and then he says, no, he's a slave. And I'm like, and then that kind of startled me. I'm like, wait, something's not right here. And then next thing you know, he says, no, he's the N-word. And that's when I kind of like, wait just a minute here. And I turned to my photographer, who was, a few feet away. He wasn't shooting at the time. And I just said, hey, turn the camera on this guy. And that was when that exchange began, from the standpoint of just kind of just holding the composure. And quite honestly, it wasn't me that decided to call the police in that situation. It was my photographer, because, I'd had enough. I was ready to go. And so, the guy decides that he was going to block our news vehicle in and not let us leave. And that was after the exchange. And so from there, a photographer was the one that says, hey man, call the cops. So we did. But what I found amazing, Judy, in that exchange, the Charleston Police Department had to call not one but 2 units, because the first supervisor that got there had this nonchalant attitude of, hey man, why don't you just let bygones be bygones? And I just kind of quizzically said to him, I said, hold on just a moment. Where were you in June of last year on that night that Dylan Roof killed 9 people walking distance from here at Mother Emanuel? And the cop blew up at me and said, I'm not taking this case. And he called another unit to come in. So that's how that whole thing kind of evolved.
And this is my question about that, Steve, because as I mentioned, there's so many ways you could have handled that. You could have completely ignored it. You could have had that confrontation but kept it to yourself. And you could have done exactly what you did, was to confront it and then put daylight on it so that people could see the reality of where we are and the things that we deal with in society today. But talk a little bit about what your thought process was in the moment and your deliberations about sharing that moment after the confrontation.
It was interesting, because part of that confrontation, I remember I said something to this young man, Brian Ivers. I'm like, with him going into all of that, and especially the whole slave thing, and it was almost like, young man, what do you know about the 9th and the 14th Amendment? I mean, I kind of pulled out part of the Bill of Rights and some of the Constitution, if you will. And there was this whole flip conversation. Did I want to get physical with him? Nah, not my style, not my speed. But I did not want to ignore it. And that was the thing that was very insane about that, was how do you handle this, hopefully with a moment of integrity, hopefully with some sensitivity, but at the same time realize and make this individual realize that you're not going to be a pushover in that situation. So I think that's where it was. And quite honestly, we sat on that story before it broke. I mean, we sat on that thing for about a week, kind of trying to figure out what was the best venue, what was the best way of handling that. And in much gratitude to the city of Charleston, in terms of the irony of all ironies, that night, I got a phone call from Mayor John Tecklenburg, who actually saw what had happened because his mother lived like 3 doors down from the cathedral, and he could watch the whole encounter and exchange from a window at the home. So he tracked me down, and we had a very nice conversation that night. But I think breaking it out moved the conversation forward and at least allowed people to say and see things, from their own perspective. Was it painful? Yes. Was it enlightening? Yes. But it had a tragic outcome because at the end of the day, Brian Ivers, the person that was involved in this, dies of a drug overdose. And we had thought that he'd had some drug problems before. I mean, part of his deal in going to court was to go to rehab, which he initially had done. As a journalist, as a person, the end game in that for me did not happen. And it was kind of disappointing because what I was hoping was that Brian Ivers and I would have gone to church together on a Sunday at Mother Emanuel to demonstrate perhaps the power of healing and the power perhaps of being somewhat progressive in what was very, very much an uncomfortable situation, Judy.
You know what? I want to get to the power of hope and the power of healing in just a moment. But as you touched on your thoughtful deliberation, which again is one of the other things that I really admire and respect about you, Steve, because in this business, we can sometimes fall victim to that urge to get a story out right away and, obviously, deal with the sensationalism aspect of it. But you are so thoughtful and so deliberate about how you approach not just your documentaries and your work on civil rights, but every single story that you approach. And it brings to mind, when we talk about the struggles that we're dealing with, right? There's so many things that we have addressed in our past, but we're dealing with in a different way today. And one example that comes to mind at the University of South Carolina, in recent years, students have been confronted with blackface and with racial slurs, like what you encountered on the streets there in Charleston. And there are always conversations in newsrooms about, should we show the picture? Should we actually use the word? Where do you weigh in? Because here's the thing, one debate is, you can't whitewash this. You need to put it out there, for everyone to see and to be able to confront it, and for us to have an intellectually honest dialogue about how to deal with these things. But at the same time, you don't want to fan the flames, and you don't want to do it for the wrong reasons. Where do you weigh in on those debates, Steve?
I think the short version is use when appropriate. Use when it's a matter of educating somebody. Use those terms as a matter of historic references, but not necessarily, we keep overusing this phrase when it becomes yelling fire in a crowded theater. I mean, I don't think you use it to incite violence. I don't think you put it on the air to elicit ratings or whatever. But I think there is a context where those kinds of terms, derogatory and all, where there is a disclaimer. The words that you're about to hear may offend some people. But at the same time, if you sugarcoat the harsh reality, folks don't necessarily understand a lot of the pain.
Well, Steve, as acclaimed as your work is on historical documentaries, you are also known for the contemporary issues that you have covered over the years. And you mentioned one of the stories that both of us covered that has really left an indelible mark. And I think about one of the stories in front of Mother Emanuel that I hope we'll have time to get to in a moment. But as we go back to that tragic shooting in 2015, talk a little bit about how you think, or if you think, your background in historical documentaries helped to inform the context and the importance of your reporting as you covered the shooting at Mother Emanuel.
That required a lot of process, Judy, from the standpoint of where you're a black journalist, you're a black man, you're a storyteller, you're an even-handed broker of information, and whatever implicit biases you may have or whatever thoughts you may have, regarding racism, a lot of it's process across the board. For me, it was kind of interesting because I got to Charleston that next morning. I wanted to go that night, but they said, no, we're going to send you down the next morning. And I ended up going to the service at Morris Brown AME, and I saw somebody that you and I both know rather well, Congressman Jim Clyburn. And in speaking to Congressman Clyburn, I gave him the news that Congressman Clyburn and I have a mutual friend here in Charlotte, Malcolm Graham, whose sister died, Cynthia Graham Hurd, who died in that shooting. I talked to Malcolm the night before trying to get information regarding what was happening in Charleston. And at the time, he didn't even know that his sister was among the wounded. Knowing the relationship between Congressman Clyburn and Malcolm, and I spoke to the congressman. I said, sir, I just wanted you to know, if you hadn't found out, Malcolm lost his sister in that shooting.
It was an attack on a race of people. It was an attack on the Christian church. It was an attack on humanity. Former North Carolina Senator Malcolm Graham lost his sister, Cynthia Graham Hurd. She was a well-known librarian in the city for more than 30 years. It's kind of hard to believe that we're coming upon a year when something tragic happened in these walls. Still seeking and trying to find understanding. Sorely miss my sister.
So there was that. And if there is a moment of redemption, I think it came the day after. Don't get me wrong, being at that church service and, where you saw Nikki Haley and Mayor Joe Riley and so many of the people, regardless of, political affiliations, all on the same page to denounce that level of violence was very moving. But Judi, I'm sure perhaps you had the same reaction that I had that next day, and I was there outside of the arraignment for Dylann Roof. And to hear those words of forgiveness, to hear the fact that so many of those families that lost loved ones, looked at Dylann Roof, on the video monitor and said, "I forgive you."
It was the words from grieving families that moved hearts.
Tawanza was my hero. But as we said in Bible study, we enjoyed you, but may God have mercy on you.
Felicia Sanders saw bullets from a gun barrel and the lives of her son, Tawanza Sanders, and aunt, Susie Jackson. She chose not to address Roof with words of hostility or a tone of bitterness.
Forgiveness is a release. Dylann Roof doesn't care if I forgive him or not. Forgiveness is for me. It's not for him.
And even in as much as we heard some of that during the trial, I think that as much as the shooting perhaps brought that level of pain, there was also a sense of redemption that came, as a result of what we saw at the courthouse that next day. And then when President Obama, was at TD Arena for the service of Revlement Pinkney and breaks into Amazing Grace, it made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. It was that profound and that deep.
Amazing Grace.
You're making the hair stand up on the back of my neck right now because I remember it, Steve. I feel like I'm standing, listening to it in this moment. And you put such an important focus. That moment of forgiveness is one that resonated not just here in South Carolina, but around the country. And I'm reminded one of the moments when I was standing outside of Mother Emanuel, and I was in the middle of doing live shots and, gathering information from my reports to come later. And a white woman approached me, and I could tell she wanted to ask a question, but she had some reservation about it, right? And you might remember this, Steve. It was when the men of Alpha Kappa Alpha stood on the stairs leading up to the front of Mother Emanuel, and they were dressed in their black suits and their gold ties. And so she wondered if that was a tradition for African American funerals. And I said, "Oh, no, ma'am." I said, "Those are the men of Alpha Phi Alpha." And that was the fraternity that Reverend Pinkney belonged to. And she was so grateful, right? Because in those moments, you can look at someone and say, "Well, how could you not know that?" And she was so taken aback by it, and she was so grateful. But it leads to my question to you, Steve, because so many times when we talk about, anything from the tragic shooting to Mother Emanuel, to the civil rights documentaries that you have done, the many important issues that you have covered, sometimes I feel like we're preaching to the choir, right? And there's a need to really expand the dialogue to include a broader group of people. How do you hope your work will serve that purpose?
Well, Judi, first, I'm going to agree with you on that. And to back up the whole Mother Emanuel experience, and you may be inclined to think the same way that I do, we live this story. Because of the fact that we have black skin, we live these stories. So in living these stories, there is a perspective that we have in terms of telling these stories, perhaps feeling an obligation, and even in as much as sharing the knowledge to enlighten people just like that woman that came up to you at Mother Emanuel Church, and as you had to explain to her about the A-Phi-A's, the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. And I find it amazing that in some regards, and not to talk down to anybody, but there are people that, who are white, who's like, "Gee, I didn't know that," or "Now I finally get it." The reaction in a lot of respects as it relates to some of the documentary projects and even news stories, it's the adage of, how do you reach one, teach one? How do you allow someone to learn something that they didn't know before? Or perhaps what I found even more amazing, how do you get someone just to spend a minute in your own shoes?
So, Steve, as we talk about Mother Emanuel, you mentioned the Confederate flag coming down at the State House. And I remember being there with you as well. And one of the conversations we had was about just that the magnitude of that moment for obvious reasons, but for other reasons that some may have overlooked. Because, Steve, I'm not sure that if that had happened at any other church in South Carolina, that it would have resulted in the flag coming down. I'm not sure if it had resulted in the death of any other pastor, it would have resulted in the flag coming down. I'm not sure if it had been any other member of the South Carolina legislature. It was almost as if Reverend Pinkney was just appointed and anointed, as they say in the church, for that moment in history, as tragic as it was, because he was kind of that one person in the South Carolina Senate that everyone had such high regard for. And as we witnessed that moment in history, it was so apparent to me how important it is for our children to understand that history, because our tendency when those things happen is to kind of shield them away from it. But what I hope, and as your work is made available through the Civil Rights Center, is that it will be used to educate our children. Because, Steve, I'm telling you, almost every time that we air one of your stories, I will hear from a South Carolina educator asking where can they get more information. And what a tremendous compliment that is to you for the compilation of work that you have done. But what is your hope in terms of how your work will be used to educate the next generation?
Well, before we go there, and you were talking about Reverend Fleming Pinkney, and there are stories that you remember that happened just like yesterday. And I remember being at the Capitol in Columbia, and they brought his body there. They brought the casket there, and there were thousands of people that were there. I mean, I remember when the horse-drawn carriage came in, and there were people saluting and the like. What moved me the most out of that, and granted there were the accolades, obviously how he started off there, at a very young age and ascended to where he was in the legislature. The moment that got me, Judy, was when I saw former governors David Beasley, a Republican, Jim Hodges, a Democrat, go in and come out together. And I interviewed them both, and it was one of those things of where Pinkney commanded just such respect to be able to allow both people with opposing points of political views in some instances to be on the same page. To answer your question, far as one's work, I hope that people can go back and take a look at some of these pieces and perhaps come away with an enhanced set of values or sense of understanding as it relates to where South Carolina has been in so many struggles. In many respects, to think about it, where you don't necessarily, at the time in the 60s, you didn't necessarily have a Goodman, Swerner, and Cheney like you had in Mississippi, or 4 girls being bombed at a church in Birmingham. And some of the struggles in South Carolina were genteel compared to what it was in other parts of the country. But the fact of the matter is, you had so many meaningful kinds of situations that you had where, you had, until Orangeburg came along, you had sit-ins, you had the year after Orangeburg, you had the South Carolina, the Charleston Hospital Workers strike. And so when you do those kinds of pieces, even in as much going back to 1963 when former Charlotte Mayor Harvey Gantt enters Clemson University, you had things that showed that in the Palmetto State, for the most part, things could be done in a very peaceful and very equitable way. And again, going back to what people walk away with is perhaps an enhanced sense of understanding of some of the developments that impacted the region in which they live.
And Steve, part of what makes your work so compelling are the interviews that you have done with these trailblazers over the years. What is it that you think gives them the confidence, the courage to be so open and in many aspects so vulnerable with you to share these stories that for many of them are painful to revisit?
I think trust, empathy, knowing that you'll treat them fairly, knowing that there really isn't a hidden agenda, realizing their words have the ability to inspire, to educate, to perhaps allow people to see a different side of things. What I find so amazing in many respects is the fact that so many of these individuals that I've had the opportunity to interview over the years, they're not bitter for the most part. Sure, there's some frustration. In the case of Friendship 9, they look at their situation where they did the 30 Days on the Chain Gang, and in York County and Rock Hill, they've gone from, in 1961, of being reviled by everybody from the governor to, the local authorities, the police and the like, to, 54 years later, to being exonerated, to being revered. And when you're able to see the fact that people can find pride in their pain, it perhaps makes telling that story all the more worthwhile.
So Steve, let me ask you about this. What a tremendous honor it is. When I heard that you were donating your papers and your films to the University of South Carolina Libraries through the Civil Rights Center, I got goosebumps, but I was just so delighted, so moved. Just, Steve, it is such an incredible honor, but it is so well deserved for all that you have invested in telling and sharing these stories. And it will be an incredibly valuable collection that will benefit students, scholars, and the public at large. I want to ask you a few questions about this. Number one, why did you agree to donate this incredible collection to the university?
You don't really know what you have until you take a look. I have to credit Dr. Bobby Donaldson for reaching out to me to make this happen. And Dr. Donaldson and I had worked together, I believe it was the summer of 2013, where we had shown the Sarah Mae Flemming documentary at the public library in Columbia on a Sunday afternoon. And that was an amazing day because they had to bring in extra chairs. And even though they brought in extra chairs, there were people still standing up against the wall. And that kind of planted the seed. And then there were so many other stories, even though I'm based out of Charlotte. I'm, Carowinds Boulevard. I'm just right down the road. And one of those things of where, and, part of the credit obviously goes to my wife, Kathy, who is a Gamecock alum. She bleeds garnet, black and white. She, along with her 3 of her siblings, are USC grads, and so I think that gave me, a lot of foresight to want to do this. But even in as much as, and I mentioned Kathy, she's the yin to my yang from the standpoint of where, she's the neatnik, I'm the pack rat, and I have tapes and films and stuff going back some 40 years from when I first got in this business. And when you start categorizing and looking at old scripts and having the raw interviews, for the most part, there's some things that have gotten away from me that I still wish I had. And, and then you kind of realize the great work that goes on at the center. And when Dr. Donaldson contacted, me and wanted to make this happen, I'm thinking, who, me? And the reason why I say it in that context, I looked at so many of the heavyweights, that have made contributions to that center and to the African American Studies Department at USC. And when I look at, some of the people that I've studied and gotten to know some of their relatives, such as Reverend J. Delane, who was instrumental in Briggs versus Elliott down in Clarendon County. Ida Quincy Newman, who was just a titan with the NAACP and the South Carolina State Legislature. When you look at somebody such as a Majeska Simpkins, who owned a bank, owned a hotel, was such a force in civil rights in the NAACP. And to have my work associated with them, I'm like, you got to be kidding me. But rather than look a gift horse in the mouth, take the gift and take the blessing and realize perhaps that some of what you've done can perhaps benefit others.
So, Steve, obviously many people are familiar with your collection of work, but the name of this collection is the Steve and Kathy Wilson Crump Collection. So I know that there is an incredible woman that you credit for really helping you to pave the way that you have. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, Kathy Wilson Crump's the light of my life. She is a USC grad. She takes to heart the colors of garnet, black and white. You can see our USC hat right there in the corner of the screen there. Sumter native. She has 2 degrees from USC. 3 of her siblings have graduated from the University of South Carolina. And so she is a Palmetto State woman through and through. And she's also had a hand in helping me pick out some of the videos and some of the printed materials that have accompanied this collection. She attended USC in the early days of integration there in the 70s, lived in the catacombs, as she calls it, and we have a lot of fond memories when we're in Columbia. I mean, she'll yell out the word game, and then somebody will say Cox, but and that's who she is.
Is this love of history something that the two of you have always shared?
I will give you a story, Judy, that you can relate to, because every year Kathy and I come to Columbia to be a part of your sororities, Alpha Kappa Alpha sororities, the Pink Ice Ball. That's always our weekend. And as a result of understanding her love of history, most years during the Pink Ice Ball, the next day or that weekend is the Boone Hall Oyster Roast in Charleston. So we'll do a weekend in South Carolina. So that particular year, several years ago, we were going to go to the Boone Hall Oyster Roast. And we stopped at the Gibbs Museum to see an art collection by another Palmetto State treasurer, Jonathan Green. And we're about to leave the Gibbs Museum. Who walks in? John Lewis. We're in the gift shop, and I see John Lewis and a staff assistant walk in. I yell, "Congressman!" And he comes over, and he remembered me from having interviewed him a number of times over the years. And he was in Charleston along with his good friend Jim Clyburn to speak at a Martin Luther King celebration. Well, the oyster roast got canceled, and we ended up going to hear John Lewis speak at the church there, and it was one of those things. So to answer your question, yeah, my wife has a great deal of understanding and appreciation for African American history, and the reality is one of the first jobs that she ever had as a teenager back in Sumter County was working for Judge Ernest Finney. So she has a sense of that. And speaking of Congressman Clyburn, his mother used to do my mother-in-law's hair back in the day. So Kathy understands all of that.
And Steve, I thought of one more question I wanted to ask, because as you receive this incredible honor, this certainly is not the end of your legacy. You still have work to do to build on it. Who is still on your list of civil rights legends or pioneers to interview?
I've had a lot of people that I've managed to talk to. Going back to your roots in Atlanta, Andrew Young, one of my heroes who I got to interview that we lost last year from Atlanta was Joe Lowry. I think you take it as it comes. The dynamic changes. There are events that perhaps shape your viewpoint as a journalist. I mean, being in Washington and with you for the Obama inauguration in 2008, and as we worked out of the same satellite truck facility, very cold day. Being back in D.C. for the unveiling or the dedication of the Martin Luther King memorial statue was very moving. And the fact that I was able to interview people such as C.T. Vivian and the like. And a lot of times it's the anniversaries, but more importantly right now, in going back to the Friendship 9, there were 9 members less than a half dozen are still alive. And I think of the people that have made just amazing contributions who are no longer with us. And, the fact that you're able to capture their stories and to provide a historical reference point is very, very important to at least get them before they say goodbye to us. So for me, it's just kind of taking it as it comes. I've interviewed Barack Obama, the Al Sharptons of the world, and, they're more contemporaries than some of the other folks that had to endure, Judy, some of the things that you and I would believe would be unthinkable that we've never had to put up with.
Well, you're certainly right about that. And as you think about those trailblazers that we lost last year, Reverend Lowry, Reverend C.T. Vivian, and Congressman John Lewis, I just have to say thank you. Thank you so much, Steve, for capturing and sharing those important stories.
You always learn something when you talk to them.
As we talk about the issues that you have covered regarding race, I would be remiss if I didn't also ask you about the racism that you have overcome in our profession in order to be able to share these stories. What can you share with us on that front?
It's almost like the theme from Love Story. Where do we begin? It's kind of amazing from the standpoint of where, I graduated college in 1980, so you do the math, it's 40 plus years ago. And my first job, I never thought I would ever end up working in the South. My first job was in Savannah, Georgia. And I was the first African-American male anchor at my station in my home state of Kentucky in Lexington. And just to go back to Savannah for a minute, and to realize the importance of civil rights and the like from the standpoint of the gravity of the people you come into contact with. And Jody, you and I have known each other for years, and knowing that you're from Atlanta and the history within that community. And for me to be a 22, 23-year-old kid straight out of college, and you're doing one-on-ones with the likes of Maynard Jackson, Julian Bond, Henry Aaron. Atlanta was the big dog city, and here I am down in the low country, interviewing these heavyweights and getting their message and understanding what it is they're promoting, what it is they've had to face, and even seeing some of the remnants of that. You talk about the racism. 1980 was just 12 years after Dr. King, had been assassinated. And there were still, as it is today, people still having problems coming to grips with some of the changes that were on the horizon. And a lot of what we see in our society could very well be carried out in newsrooms. Newsrooms in some regards are a microcosm of what it is we see in society. And even in as much as being, the crazy kid back in the day that would go out and cover cross burnings, and to have survived that. So, there is a moment, I will never ever forget this. There was a Klan rally that I covered in this town called Willacoochee, Georgia. And there was a crew there from CBS Sunday Morning. And, my debut on a network television in 1981 is getting my behind kicked out of a KKK rally.
On the day the Klan appeared in South Georgia, Route 82 was a highway of contrasts. Down the road from Willacoochee in a farmer's field was blatant racism. A reporter from Savannah was barred from covering the event.
We'll go over there. I'll talk to Mr. Wilkerson.
Okay, we were invited to this as a news event. That's me 35 years ago getting the boot.
But the insane part of that was they had done this piece, and I remember it just like it was last night. And the phone rang, and I picked it up, and it was my mom back home in Louisville, Kentucky. And she says, "Stephen?" And there was this pregnated pause. And it was the tone of Stephen, like, "I don't live there. What have I done now?" And she, at the top of her lungs, "We saw you this morning, and you could have been killed," and and that whole thing. So what happened, in Charleston? What happened in Willacoochee, Georgia? When you see that level of racism carried on camera, it's just part of the landscape that we navigate, Judy.
It is indeed. I wonder what your advice is to the up-and-coming generation of journalists about covering these same very complex issues as we look at the riots and protests across the country, calling for racial equity, calling for social justice, calling for reforming the police, and all of these complex issues that we're working to digest and to explain to the audiences and communities that we serve. What is your advice to young journalists about being able to capture these stories and being able to share them in an intellectually honest way to move and inform the conversation and have a positive impact?
There's no simple answer. It's almost like I wish there was a kind of an AP style guide to covering race relations and covering unrest and the like. Some of it you make up as you go along. I think, the advice to young people, don't take a lot of it personally. Realize why you're there. Own it. But in owning it, have a sense of responsibility. In owning it, understand who your viewers are. Realize your duty to them, even though you may have your own shares of beliefs. Don't let those inherent beliefs cloud your judgment of being a true broker of the information that you're supposed to be sharing. And I think have a sense of obligation, knowing that words, not just the words, the pictures matter. I mean, when you look at everything that we've seen from George Floyd to the Breonna Taylor story, which happened in my hometown, to Philando Castillo, to just so many people, but at the same time understanding the weight that what it is you say carries, the influence that you have, and perhaps in that regard, that can give some clarity to the responsibility that individually and collectively that we have as African American journalists.
Well, Steve, as your incredible legacy takes up permanent residence at the University of South Carolina through the Civil Rights Center, what is it that you ultimately hope as people read your papers and as people watch your films? What is it that you ultimately hope they will take away from that experience?
I hope they learn something. I hope that they find something in history that they didn't get in a 3-hour course in somebody's classroom. I hope that it's something that will lead them to do further scholarship, further research. I'm hoping that people will be enlightened, not from an egocentric standpoint, but from a standpoint that provides a certain level of inspired intellectualism. Going out and finding out more about people such as Dr. Benjamin Mays, who was one of the great folks at Morehouse, who comes from the town of 96, South Carolina. Learning more about what happened in Rock Hill, South Carolina to John Lewis, even though Selma gets the lion's share of attention as far as what John Lewis endured in 1965. It was 4 years earlier, in 1961, that John Lewis bled during the Freedom Rides in York County, South Carolina, just an hour north of the University of South Carolina. So I'm hoping that folks will find a sense of enlightenment.
Well, I have no doubt that they will, Steve. Thank you for the education. Thank you for the inspiration and for the incredibly powerful legacy that you have laid to empower the next generation.
Judi, thank you for your friendship and for all that you continue to do across South Carolina, and the fact that you're a meaningful treasurer in that state and in the city of Columbia.
Thank you for your friendship as well. It means all the world to me.